Greetings, comrades! This day has finally come. To be honest, I delayed it for quite a long time, and my most faithful followers had to wait for a whole year for it. So, what do we already know about Soviet architecture? That Khrushchevkas are small grey boxes and Brezhnevkas are big grey boxes 90% of the time. And that begs the question, what about Stalin? So, these two Soviet leaders got series of houses named after them and went down in history of house building in the USSR, but Stalin did not? Do not worry, today we will fill this gap and talk about Stalinkas. That is, the houses built in the USSR from the mid-20s of the 20th century to the mid-50s. I'll tell you why to this day, almost 100 years later, apartments in some of these houses can be considered the best options in the real estate market in Russia. And also why it is practically impossible to live in some Stalinkas without daily suffering. So let me explain a couple of things. First of all, why did I put Stalinkas last in my series of videos about Soviet housing and not started with them? After all, chronologically it was the Stalinkas that emerged first. The thing is that the Stalinkas are the least standardized type of houses of all three. Usually a foreigner who knows something about Soviet architecture imagines something like this when he hears the word Stalinka. The Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, the famous Seven Moscow Sisters, the Leninsky Avenue houses. And here comes the second important thing. Some people truly believe that the Stalinkas are only luxurious houses built for the elite of the USSR, with huge apartments and exquisitely decorated exteriors. But I actually have a different opinion and prefer to consider all houses which were built in the USSR from the 30s to the death of the Soviet leader as Stalinkas. And in that case, technically it turns out that this house, for example, built in 1950 is also a Stalinka. And believe me, it looks no better from the inside than from the outside. So why did the houses built in those years differ so much? It's actually because, unlike Khrushchev and Brezhnev, Stalin during his 30 years of reign never prioritized the task of providing the population with decent housing conditions in individual apartments. That is why residential buildings under him were built very chaotically, without a clearly defined plan and a unified design. But first things first, it's history time. Actually, I've already covered this topic in my video about Kommunalkas, so I'll repeat it all really briefly. The main goal of the USSR in the 1930s was industrialization, which included the relocation of people from the countryside to the cities. And this meant huge problems with housing, because the existing Soviet cities simply did not have enough buildings to accommodate all these people. Of course, it was possible to squeeze families together and put 20 people in one communal apartment. But that couldn't continue forever, could it? Therefore, Stalin's government still faced the issue of the construction of new residential buildings. But then again, in the conditions of a very accelerated industrialization of the country, an unambiguous priority was given to industrial construction, while cultural and household construction received minimal investments. With all this, by the beginning of the 30s, the USSR has built more than 1 million square meters of housing. Unfortunately, these houses could hardly be called interesting or good. These buildings were low-rise because there was simply not enough money and materials to build quality high-rise buildings. Every single piece of more or less high-quality material was used for the construction of industrial enterprises, and residential houses were built from any kind of stuff that was available. For example, in Moscow in 1920s and 1930s, freshly constructed buildings mostly resembled barracks or pre-revolutionary revenue houses. However, some of these houses have still survived the test of time, such as those in the village of Sokol, Moscow's first low-rise housing complex. Of course, there were some exceptions, such as several buildings for top Red Army generals on Patriarch's Ponds or other interesting and unique projects like the Commune House on Ordzhonikidze Street. But we will not go into detail, especially since these houses were absolutely unique and can literally be counted on the fingers of one hand. The important thing is that at that time no one really thought much about building enough housing for the citizens of the USSR. At that time the idea of the communal way of life and the socialist utopia was still alive, and practically everything was supposed to be shared, and hence so was the housing. The conditions in which individual citizens lived did not matter. The main thing was to live together and for the sake of a common goal. That was the idea. To assess the real situation with housing, let's take a look at Magnitogorsk, a typical working-class city, which was rapidly developing in the 1930s. So, the residents of Magnitogorsk at the end of the 1930s lived in barracks, dugouts and other temporary dwellings, communal housing, self-built houses, and cottages for executives. A small remark about dugouts. In other cities the percentage was probably much lower, but people did live in them. That is, as you can see, it is hard to talk about any special Stalinkas before the beginning of World War II, because 80% of the inhabitants of a typical Soviet city lived either in temporary housing or in communal housing in the pre-revolutionary housing stock. Nevertheless, around the same time in Moscow and other major cities, the first buildings that now can certainly be called Stalinkas began to be constructed. So let's finally figure out what these mysterious Stalinkas are and how to distinguish them from other types of Soviet houses. In architectural terms, although I'm not an architect, the style of the pre-war Stalinkas is usually described as post-constructivism, and the post-war ones as Stalinist Empire style. But personally I think that it is much easier to divide Stalinkas according to their initial purpose. By building design and apartment layout, Stalinkas are clearly divided into two types: elite and ordinary Stalinkas. Yes, just as Grandpa Orwell bequeathed, all animals are equal and so on. The nomenclatura houses, also departmental housing or Vedomki, were built for the highest strata of Soviet society, for parties, Soviet and economic leaders, high-ranking military officials and employees of security agencies, for prominent members of the scientific and creative intelligentsia. In fact, when people nowadays talk about luxurious Stalinkas, they are talking about these type of houses. Beautiful apartments inside even more magnificent buildings with wide staircases and wrought iron railings. Apartments in these houses had spacious kitchens, separate toilets, high ceilings decorated with stucco with rooms up to 30 square meters. Some houses even provided workshops for sculptors and artists, and of course, no communal accommodation. After all, these were the houses for respectable people. Ranking slightly lower were directors' houses. They differed by slightly less rich decoration and were more often found not in the capital but in various regional centers of the USSR. In other aspects, they were not really inferior to the first category. Buildings of this type were usually erected in the center of the cities, when developing central avenues and main streets, near parks and squares. They were built according to individual designs and are still architectural landmarks of their cities. Then there are ordinary houses, which were designed for common workers. They had reduced apartment areas and no frills like separate rooms for offices or storage rooms. But because of the relative surplus of free 4-room apartments in relation to the real demographic of people queuing for housing, some of them were assigned to communal housing. There are also houses that look like Stalinkas on the outside, but inside they have a typical dormitory layout, rows of 1-room apartments with shared bathrooms and kitchens. Such houses in general began to appear after the war, and they still had some advantages. For example, they no longer had wooden ceilings. Finally, the last type of Stalinkas are low-rise Stalinkas, 1-3 stories high. This is probably the worst category of these buildings. Such houses were mostly built according to pre-designed standard series, which included several variants of houses, with 1, 2 or 3 units, corner houses and those with stores on the first floor, as well as communal houses. Low-rise construction was used because it did not require much construction machinery, could be carried out by low-skilled workers, including German and common prisoners, and did not take long to build. This explains the nickname of some of these houses, German houses, although not all of them were built by German prisoners of war. The framework of low-rise houses was simplified and of much lower quality than that of the full-scale Stalinkas. Hollow brick or cinder blocks, wooden ceilings, no basements. Low-rise houses were usually designed for workers' settlements attached to big factories. Sometimes they lacked even the most basic amenities – central heating, water and sewerage. There were even variants of the houses that lacked all of them together. In this case, the toilets were located separately in the yard of the house, and the house was heated with stoves. But this was still more of an exception to the rule. Low-rise Stalinkas occupy a kind of intermediate position between real Stalinkas and temporary barrack-type buildings. As I mentioned in the beginning, many people in Russia do not consider such houses as true Stalinkas, precisely because of their low quality. They believe that Stalinka is about multi-story monumental buildings with rich external decorations. But, excuse me, how else can one call a house built under Stalin according to a standard project and in large numbers? Only Stalinka. So why did I focus so much on this particular type? It's simple, I was born in one of these. And yes, it was a communal apartment, in which 2 rooms were given to my parents' family with another family living in the third one. Fortunately, this house had quite spacious rooms, centralized water supply, even separate bathroom and toilet. But other than that, the quality of the construction of the house left a lot to be desired. I remember when I was 14, a huge piece of ceiling in my bedroom suddenly decided to collapse. At least the neighbors didn't fall right down on my head. Or the story about how we once removed the ventilation grate in the bathroom and saw that there was a bricked up wall behind the grate. That is, there's supposed to be a ventilation system in it, but the builders just decided not to do it. They made small notches in the walls and covered them with grates, so that the commission approving the building did not notice it, and they succeeded. In general, every time someone begins to talk about how good were all Stalinkas and how well they were built, I remember my own home with a chuckle. But let's go over the positive qualities of these houses. First of all, the positive qualities of Stalinkas should certainly include their external appearance. Even if we talk about those very bad low-rise houses, still, the district filled with them with proper care looks 100 times better than the grey neighborhood of Hrushchevkas. All thanks to the presence of plaster, stucco decor, columns, bay windows, balconies of various shapes, complex multi-sloped roofs and other architectural excesses condemned by Nikita Khrushchev's 1955 decree. All this makes the Stalinkas look individual, and that's awesome. And I'm not even talking about the elite houses, which was the very illustration of the word excess. It is believed that no two are alike among them at all. Second, the materials. Most of the Stalinkas were made of brick, and this is much better than the concrete slabs of Hrushchevkas and Brezhnevkas. This, by the way, is another feature by which you can distinguish elite Stalinkas from the ordinary. Brick buildings tend to have higher number of floors, an exquisite facade, spacious apartments, better noise insulation, and the apartments are very warm. Ordinary and low-rise houses, on the other hand, were built using lower quality materials. And the inner walls in such houses were generally built of some kind of construction waste. No, seriously, my father once found a broken window frame right inside the wall between the toilet and the hallway. Third positive thing is that each house had a basement and bomb shelter in case of war. Just kidding, hardly a big advantage nowadays. But bomb shelters were indeed in almost every house, even in those built after the war. Fourth, the ceilings in Stalinkas were generally no lower than 3 meters high. And if in the nomenclature houses it is due to elite housing status, then in ordinary Stalinkos everything is simpler. In Stalinkos for workers it is due to the calculations for communal dwelling. Several people living in one room need a certain amount of air, and it can be easily achieved by raising the ceiling. Finally, the advantage of Stalinkos is a rather low density of inhabitants. There are usually 2, 3 or 4 apartments on one floor, and this means that you basically know all your neighbors and you don't feel like you are living in an anthill. Now to the more controversial qualities. First, like I said, Stalinkos vary greatly in the availability of amenities. For example, there are houses in which the main water supply pipes pass directly under the floor of the first-story tenants, and it means that in case of any failure, utility workers will come to the apartment and crack open your precious parquet floor. Not a very pleasant thing. Do not forget about the ceilings, which in 90% of pre-war and 50% of post-war Stalinkos were wooden. People living in such buildings should be extremely wary of fire. I've personally witnessed that low-rise Stalinkos burn like candles. Also, in all houses, not only Stalinkos but also Hrushchevkas built after the war, the garbage chute and elevator were installed only if they had 6 floors or more, regardless of the people who received free housing in them. Yes, even if you are a minister, be kind enough to walk up to a 5th floor of a 5-story building. Although perhaps this is for the best. There are elevators in high-rise Stalinka buildings, but they are very small and it's often just scary to use them. Plus, let's not forget about a number of strange decisions in the layout of apartments, ranging from the abundance of pass-through rooms and finishing with the famous window between the bathroom and the kitchen. And of course, we can't forget that the newest of these houses are about 70 years old. In that time, any infrastructure can fall into decay. The plaster falls off, the roof leaks, the wooden floors rot. The electrical networks in Stalinkos simply were not intended for the powerful electrical devices of today, and their yards were designed without any thoughts of parking lots or underground garages. But all these disadvantages pale in front of the benefits of this housing in the event that the house and the apartment itself were taken care of. So that's how the Stalinkos are. The best of all variants of the Soviet houses, and maybe the worst at the same time. But it is necessary to note that they are much more interesting and original than Brezhnevkas and particularly Hrushchevkas, in pretty much everything from appearance to layouts. And do not forget that the elite Stalinkos are basically a living history. If you live in a Stalinka in the city center, then there is a possibility that a prominent party official or a famous Soviet scholar lived there before you. And due to the fact that many of those houses were built with the expectation of 120 to 150 years of service, they will adorn the main streets of many cities in Russia and the CIS countries for many years to come, reminding everyone of a vanished Soviet era.